There are people who become famous, and then there are people who become mythic. He was supposed to be one of them. The kid who wrote a screenplay in 3.5 days. The fighter who refused to sell his soul. The man who turned a borrowed dream into one of the most beloved stories ever told. The world looked at him and saw Rocky. They saw strength, grit, and an iron will that could not be broken. But what if the man behind the myth was quietly carrying something far heavier than any of the weights he ever lifted on screen? What does it actually cost a man to become a legend? And what happens when the very qualities that built the empire, the stubbornness, the hunger, the refusal to stop, become the same forces that quietly tear a life apart from the inside? These are not easy questions. They're the kind of questions that linger in the silence between the trophies, in the gaps between the sequels, in the spaces that no camera ever caught. Because for all the footage of Sylvester Stallone throwing punches and charging up movie poster staircases, there is a story behind that story. A longer one, a harder one that started not in Hollywood, but in a cold New York City walk-up apartment, with a mother who read the future in the stars and a father who left scars that never fully healed. This is that story. Sylvester Enzio Stallone was born on July 6, 1946, at the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of New York City. The delivery was difficult. Forceps were used during the birth, and they damaged a nerve, permanently paralyzing parts of his lower left face, his lip, his chin, and part of his tongue. From the very first breath he drew in this world, something was already marked on him, something that would make people stare, something that would make casting directors in Hollywood laugh him out of rooms before he ever opened his mouth to speak. His speech was slurred. His face drooped on one side. And in a city that was already hard and indifferent, being the kid who talked funny was not a small thing. It was the kind of difference that children can be absolutely merciless about. His mother, Jackie, was a character in her own right, a flamboyant, astrology-obsessed woman who ran a female wrestling promotion later in life and who read meaning into everything, including the stars above her son's crib. She believed, with the kind of conviction that borders on madness, that her boy was destined for greatness. She told him so, repeatedly, in a household that gave him very little else to hold on to. That belief was something, maybe the only thing. His father, Frank Stallone Sr., was a different kind of force entirely. Frank was a hairdresser who had emigrated from Gioia del Colle, Italy, and he brought with him a temper that could fill a room like a weather system. Home was not always safe. It was not always warm. Sylvester and his younger brother Frank Jr. grew up learning to read the atmosphere the moment they walked through a door, learning to make themselves small or scarce depending on what mood the air was carrying that day. When his parents divorced, Sylvester was just 11 years old. He was sent to live with his mother, but the disruption had already done its work. He bounced through schools, 14 different ones in the span of his childhood, by most accounts. Each new school meant new hallways, new hierarchies, new reasons for other kids to notice him and find him lacking. The drooping face, the slurred speech, the clothes that weren't quite right. He was not the kind of boy who blended in. He was always, unmistakably, the odd one out. The one constant was the movies. There was a particular quality to the way young Sylvester watched films. It wasn't passive. It was hungry. He would study the actors on screen the way some boys studied baseball cards or comic book heroes. He watched the way a man could walk into a room on screen and command everything in it just by carrying himself a certain way. He watched the way a story could lift a person out of wherever they were sitting and drop them somewhere entirely different. He wanted that. He needed that. Not just to watch it, but to make it. To be the one holding the screen. That he attended the American College of Switzerland for a time, and then transferred to the University of Miami, where he studied drama. His professors did not always encourage him. One, in a moment of casual cruelty that Stallone has recounted more than once over the years, told him plainly that with his look and his voice, he should consider a career behind the camera. Not in front of it, that he did not listen. He moved to New York after dropping out of college, and what followed was the kind of stretch that strips a person down to whatever they are actually made of at the core, that he was broke. Genuinely, desperately broke in the way that New York City has a particular talent for making a person feel. He slept in the Port Authority bus terminal on at least one occasion because he had nowhere else to go. He took whatever work he could find, small acting gigs, a role in a softcore film he would later spend decades trying to distance himself from, a job cleaning lion cages at the Central Park Zoo. The humiliation was real. The city did not care who he planned to become. He had a dog during this time, a bull mastiff named Butkus, named after the famous NFL linebacker Dick Butkus. Butkus was not just a pet. In the loneliness and grinding uncertainty of those years, that dog was a companion in a way that went beyond the ordinary. He was something living and warm to come home to, something that did not judge the slurred speech or the drooping lip, something that needed him, which meant he was needed, that IT would get worse before it got better. But Butkus was there through the worst of it. There's a particular kind of despair that comes not from failure, but from invisibility. Stallone was not failing. He was simply not being seen. He was sending himself into auditions and leaving them with nothing. He was writing, always writing, filling notebooks with ideas and scripts and characters because the writing cost nothing and the writing could be done anywhere, even in a cold apartment with the heat turned off. But nothing was landing. Nothing was connecting. He was a man shouting into a void that was completely uninterested in shouting back. Then, in March of 1975, he watched the Ollie Chuck Wepner fight on closed-circuit television. Wepner was a journeyman heavyweight from Bayonne, New Jersey, a man who was not supposed to last more than a few rounds against the greatest boxer who ever lived. And Wepner went 15 rounds. He got knocked down. He got back up. He got knocked down again. He kept getting up. He did not win. But what he did that night was something that transcended winning. Stallone went home from that fight and did not sleep, that he sat at his kitchen table and he started writing. For 3.5 days, he barely stopped. He wrote the entire screenplay for Rocky in something closer to a fever than a process. It poured out of him, the fighter from the wrong side of Philadelphia, the woman he loved who could barely meet his eyes, the club manager who saw something in a body that the rest of the world had already written off. He wrote himself into every frame of it without quite knowing he was doing it. Rocky Balboa was the kid from Hell's Kitchen. Rocky Balboa was the boy who slept in bus terminals. Rocky Balboa was every person who had ever been told they had the wrong face or the wrong voice or the wrong zip code to be taken seriously. The screenplay was good. He knew it was good. But the story of what happened next is one of the more remarkable things in Hollywood history, because the studios knew it was good too, and they wanted it. Badly. They just did not want him. The offers came in. Real money. Life-changing money for a man who had recently been deciding whether to eat or keep the lights on. United Artists offered him $25,000 for the script. Then they went higher. Eventually, the offers reached into 6 figures. One account puts it at $360,000. For a man sleeping in bus stations not long before, this was not a number. This was a different life entirely. The condition was that Stallone would not star in it. They had Ryan O'Neal in mind. James Caan, Burt Reynolds, real stars, established faces, men who did not have a drooping lip and a mumbling diction and zero box office history. Stallone understood the logic. He also understood that if he took the money without the role, Rocky would be made and it would be someone else's movie. Someone else's Rocky. Someone else's story told with someone else's face, that he said no. Every time, at every dollar amount. No, there is a word for this kind of decision. It is not courage exactly, because courage implies calculation. What Stallone did was closer to faith. A faith that was completely untethered from evidence or reason. He had nothing to point to and say, look, here is proof that I can carry a film. He had no proof. He had only the certainty, irrational, stubborn, unshakable, that this story was his and that he had to be the one to tell it. The producers eventually relented. They greenlit the film with Stallone in the lead, but they did it on the tightest budget imaginable. $1 million. In 1975, that was not a lavish budget. It required creativity at every turn, every scene, every location choice. Stallone did something during the production that he has talked about with a kind of quiet devastation. He had to sell his dog, Butkus. The bull mastiff who had stayed with him through the bus terminal nights and the lion cage days and the years of invisible suffering. He sold Butkus to a man outside a 7-Eleven for $50 because he could not afford to feed him. He has said that he stood there on that sidewalk after the transaction was complete and cried. Not quietly, openly, like a man who understood that something essential had just walked away on 4 legs. He then did something that tells you everything you need to know about Sylvester Stallone's particular brand of insanity. When the Rocky deal finally came through, one of the first things he did was go back to that 7-Eleven. He found the man who had bought Butkus. The man did not want to sell him back. Stallone had to pay $3,000 to get his dog back. That he paid it without hesitation. Rocky was released on November 21st, 1976. It was not expected to be a phenomenon. It was a small film about a nobody from Philadelphia with a dream that was slightly too big for his body. And it absolutely devastated audiences. It became one of the highest-grossing films of that year. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor for Stallone, making him only the 3rd person in Oscar history to be nominated for both writing and acting in the same film, a distinction previously held only by Charlie Chaplin and Orson Welles. He was 30 years old. The world had arrived. All at once, like a freight train, what followed was the kind of success that sounds wonderful from the outside and is significantly more complicated from within. The sequels came: Rocky II in 1979, Rocky III in 1982, Rocky IV in 1985, Rocky V in 1990. And alongside Rocky, there was Rambo. First Blood in 1982 launched a second iconic franchise, a second character who lived in the cultural bloodstream the way few fictional creations ever managed to. Stallone was not just a movie star. He was a kind of cultural shorthand, an idea, the comeback, the underdog, the man who got back up. But no amount of box office success inoculates a person against their private life. His marriage to Sasha Zack, with whom he had 2 sons, Sage and Sergio, ended in divorce in 1985. Sergio was diagnosed with autism at a young age, and Stallone has spoken about the early years of navigating that reality, the fear and love and uncertainty that comes with a child who needs more than ordinary parenting can provide. He threw himself into advocacy for autism awareness, funding research, and speaking openly about his son in a cultural moment when autism was even less understood than it is today. His relationship with Bridget Nielsen, the Danish actress and model he married in 1985, just 11 days after his divorce from Sasha was finalized, was volatile and brief. They divorced in 1987. It was tabloid fodder at the time, dissected and mocked in the way the press of that era treated any celebrity implosion with cheerful savagery. And then, in 1994, he married Jennifer Flavin. She would become the longest and most anchoring relationship of his adult life. They had 3 daughters together, Sophia, Sistine, and Scarlett. He has spoken about his daughters with a gentleness that sits differently on his face than his movie star grin. They softened something in him, or perhaps they revealed something that had always been there underneath the armor. But in 2022, news broke that Jennifer had filed for divorce after 25 years of marriage. The reasons cited were murky. There were competing accounts in the press, allegations about a tattoo replacement and what it symbolized, and then a reconciliation that came relatively quickly. They ultimately withdrew the divorce filing and announced they were working things out, that a quarter-century of marriage nearly ending, then being pulled back from the edge. That is not a story of a Hollywood power couple with a clean narrative. That is a story of 2 people who had, apparently, managed to build something real enough to be worth fighting for. But in the middle of all of this, something else was coming. In July of 2012, Stallone's son Sage died. Sage Moonblood Stallone was 36 years old. He was found in his Hollywood home, and the cause of death was later determined to be atherosclerotic coronary artery disease, a heart condition. He was young. He was too young, and he was his father's firstborn son, a young man who had appeared with his father in Rocky V, who had grown up in the impossibly bright shadow of one of the most famous names in film history. There is no adequate way to describe what it means to bury a child. There are no metaphors that hold the weight of it. Stallone did not speak extensively to the press in the immediate aftermath. He didn't have to. You could see it when he appeared publicly in the weeks and months that followed. Something had gone out of him, something that the cameras could not help but catch, a stillness behind the eyes, a gravity in the way he held himself that had not been there before, that he has said in various interviews over the years since, that the loss reshaped his understanding of time, that it made him think differently about legacy and presence and the things that cannot be gotten back. Faith, which he has identified as Catholic, though his relationship with it is personal and not performative, became more present in his life after Sage's death. Not as an answer to the unanswerable, but as a place to bring the weight when it became too heavy to carry alone. He was in his mid-60s when Sage died. He was already, by almost any measure, a man who had lived several lifetimes' worth of experience. And yet something about losing a child resets the clock. It puts you back at zero in ways that all the previous losses never quite managed. That he kept working. He has always kept working. In 2015, he returned to the Rocky universe in a completely different mode, appearing as the aging, ailing Mickey. No, as Rocky himself, now the trainer, in Creed, a film about the son of his former rival Apollo Creed. His performance earned him a Golden Globe and his first major award season recognition in decades. Critics who had written him off, who had treated him as a relic of a certain kind of unsophisticated masculine cinema, were suddenly looking at him again. Looking closely, because what he brought to that screen in Creed was not acting in the conventional sense. It was something rawer. He was playing a man dealing with mortality, with regret, with the question of what your life meant and who it mattered to. He was playing a man whose best years were behind him, who had lost people, who was quietly preparing to lose more. He did not have to reach for any of that. It was sitting right there on the surface, barely covered. T-79, Sylvester Stallone continues to make films, to show up, to put the armor back on. He launched the documentary series about his life, which offered a level of access and vulnerability that surprised audiences who expected the usual celebrity myth-making. He talked about his parents' failures. He talked about his own. He talked about his children in a way that made it clear he understood, perhaps too late and too well, that the thing he had always been most afraid to lose was not the career or the money or the recognition. It was connection. It was the people. He has said that what he wants to leave behind is not the franchises, not Rocky, not Rambo, not any of the characters who made him famous. He wants to leave behind a sense, transmitted to his daughters and to anyone who watched long enough to see past the surface, that it is possible to be imperfect and still worthy of love. That it is possible to fail your family and still choose, while there is still time, to show up differently. That a man is not the sum of his worst moments. Butkus, the bull mastiff who was sold for $50 and bought back for $3,000, died during the filming of Rocky II. Stallone has spoken about this with the kind of grief that most people reserve for humans, and rightly so. That dog had been with him through the invisible years, through the worst of the worst. He was in the actual film, the real Butkus, not a trained Hollywood animal, but Stallone's own dog, running alongside him in the training montages that became iconic. He is frozen there in the film, permanently 30, permanently running. There is something in that image worth sitting with. Now here is where this story turns toward you, and I need you to stay with me for this last part. You've been watching this story unfold, and maybe you've been thinking about it as something that happened to someone else. Someone famous. Someone whose life is fundamentally different from your own. But I want to challenge that assumption because I think the distance is smaller than it appears. Think about what Sylvester Stallone actually represents. Not the movies, not the muscles, the real thing underneath all of it. He is a man who was told, in 100 different ways, that he was not the right kind of person. That his face was wrong, his voice was wrong, his background was wrong. And instead of accepting that verdict, he sat at a kitchen table and wrote the story he needed to tell, even when no one was asking for it. You know what that feels like. Maybe not in Hollywood. Maybe not on a movie screen. But you know what it feels like to have something inside you that the world does not seem to have a place for. You know what it feels like to be told, in words or in silence, that you're not quite the right shape for the room you're standing in. You also know, if you have lived long enough, what it feels like to lose someone, to have a person that you cannot get back, to stand in the gap between who you were before that loss and who you are after it, wondering if you will ever quite close the distance. That particular grief does not belong to the famous. It belongs to everyone. It belongs to you. And you know what it feels like to question whether you have been present enough, whether you gave enough of yourself to the people who needed you, or whether you were off somewhere chasing something that seemed urgent and turned out in the rearview mirror to be less important than the faces you missed at dinner. Stallone has never resolved all of those questions. He has never tied his life into a neat package with a label that explains everything. He is still here, still working, still trying, still carrying the things that cannot be put down, still at 79, showing up. And that old dog, that bull mastiff who ran beside him in the training montages, who was sold for $50 in a desperate moment and bought back for $3,000 because some things are simply not for sale. That dog represents something that no amount of success could have purchased and no amount of failure could have erased. It was the refusal to abandon the things that mattered at SO. Here is the question I want to leave with you. Not as a neat conclusion, not as a motivational poster, but as a real and uncomfortable question that I think deserves a real answer from you. Quietly, somewhere inside where no one else can hear. What have you been willing to go back for? What have you sold in a desperate moment that you have not yet gone back to reclaim? And is there still time? Because there might be. But time, as Sylvester Stallone will tell you without being asked, has a way of moving faster than you think it will. And the bus terminal years do not last forever. Neither does anything else.